What's the number of refugees accepted by other countries? You see, some have taken in 100, others 300, 500, 1,000. I'm sorry, but the word full is not written on our forehead. We are patient to a certain point. Then we will do what's necessary. These buses and planes aren't waiting here for nothing. The ones that give us this advice should also give it to other member countries of the United Nations, so we can send some of these refugees to those countries. But when we say this, they become uncomfortable.
The Secretary-General of the Norwegian Refugee Council says many of the world's richest countries are the least supportive when it comes to helping displaced people. Jan Egeland made headlines when he told Turkish media that Europe and the United States are making what he called embarrassingly small efforts to support refugees. And while countries such as Turkey and Lebanon have together taken in more than 4 million refugees, other countries resist accepting even a fraction of that number. Well, Jan joins me now from Oslo. Good to have you with us. So the richest countries are the least generous when it comes to refugees. Why do you think that is?
Well, they are indeed the least generous in terms of receiving refugees and giving protection on their soul, whereas Turkey is the most generous in absolute numbers. 3.5 million refugees now get protection in Turkey. That is fantastic. Lebanon, small place, well over 1 million. Of course, many of the so-called rich countries, my own country, Norway for that matter, is generous in providing aid, providing resources for our humanitarian relief in the field. But, you know, why aren't we opening our borders and giving safe haven here? Well, I think there is a bit of xenophobia. I think there is a fear for refugees that is creeping in too many places. And it's a shame, really, because we should all know that those people fleeing could be you and me, my family. We need more countries to open their borders.
Well, I think you've hit the nail on your head. A lot of countries would say that the issue of migrants and refugees is a political issue. It's also a security issue. Countries in the EU have, of course, set aside budgets to try and look after the people that reach their shores, and they've got a quota system in place. Are you saying that this isn't enough?
Yeah, well, the quota system doesn't work, really. I mean, the European Union were supposed to really alleviate Italy and Greece with quotas, receiving people. But it's true that was said initially in your segment here. I mean, there are European countries who have taken 100, 200, 300 refugees and have not taken their part of the quotas that the European Union said would be allocated according to size and the economy and so on throughout Europe. What we need is a burden sharing, or rather a responsibility sharing system globally, where all of the countries, at least 100 of the 200 countries on Earth, could receive refugees, including all of Europe, North America, many Asian countries. And if we then, on the basis of such a responsibility sharing system, ask the High Commissioner for Refugees to say who's really in need of protection, we could have solved this tremendous refugee challenge.
What we're seeing are measures from Europe to try and reduce the number of refugees coming to their countries. What do you think about Italy's plan to send ships to Libyan waters to try and stop people smuggling, to try and stop people crossing the Mediterranean?
Well, nobody likes people smugglers, and it's an abhorrent thing. They profit from smuggling desperate human beings. But the problem is that is the persecution, is the fear, it's what drives people out. We need to look at peace work, at humanitarian work, at development work in the countries of origin. Italy is in a very difficult situation. It is not helped sufficiently by the rest of Europe. Same for Greece. These countries feel that they are the end destination of those people who come from North Africa or through the Middle East. We need a summit meetings where leaders meet and say, can we sit down together and help people together and not specialize in barbed fences and building walls around the national borders.
I know this is something that you get very frustrated about, and it's not just about finding a place for these people to go. It's about offering them, a quality of life, an education, employment. And to that end, you've praised Turkey for its role in trying to help Syrian refugees get into, down some of those paths.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I was just now in Turkey. I met with the Turkish ministries of Foreign Affairs, of Interior, and with AFAD, the Turkish Civil Defense Organization. I was impressed by Turkey not only saying we have received 3.5 million refugees, 3 of them million from Syria, but also that we will give them access to our school system, have given us access to the public school system, to the public health system, and we will allow them to work in Turkey, employment. That is an example to other countries. There are, even among those who are generously in opening their border, it's not the same generosity in saying you can work in our country, you can access our public health and educational systems.
Yeah, I know the Norwegian Refugee Council has been working with Syrian refugees in Turkey. What about helping Syrians across the border in Syria? I mean, some of them are in really bad situations, and it's really difficult to reach some of those areas with humanitarian assistance, isn't it?
It is. I mean, a refugee doesn't want to become a refugee. They want to stay at home. Most of them want to return home as soon as possible. So we do enormous efforts to help Syrians inside Syria, both before they are displaced so that they can avoid being displaced, and internally displaced people so that they can get adequate support within Syria and are able to return to their places of origin. Then we help neighboring countries. We've been able to do good work in Turkey, but even larger scale and for a longer time in Lebanon, in Jordan, and in Iraq. We want to help the host societies. We need more funding to help the host societies. All in all, it's not hopeless. We can solve the refugee crisis, but then we need more money, we need more peace efforts, we need more development efforts, and we really need more support for those who are host communities today. And we need more countries to open up for quota refugees whom we cannot help locally or in the neighborhood of their problems.
There was a chink of light in the conflict in Syria recently when the de-conflict zones were agreed, several areas where the fighting was reduced or erased completely. Are you confident that they will hold and that maybe they can be built on at future negotiations which are coming up?
Well, it is indeed a glimmer of hope that there are these so-called de-escalation zones, de-escalation of the violence it's supposed to be. These are zones agreed upon in negotiations between Russia, Turkey, and Iran. Also in the south, the United States and Jordan have been involved. I think it is very welcome that external powers, both the regional powers and global powers, are investing more in bringing parties to the negotiating table and de-escalate the violence, because too many parties have brought fuel to this fire by supporting armed men fighting each other and hurting civilians. So indeed, I think that 2017 will be a good year towards the end of this year. I think more people will get assistance. I think there will be less violence, and I think there will be less attacks against civilians. It can only get better because it has been so bad for such a long time. Remember, the Syrian war has lasted longer now than the Second World War.
Another conflict, of course, is Yemen. I know that you've come back from a recent trip in Yemen. You were visibly shocked, I think, by the level of suffering that you saw there. You called it a man-made catastrophe. Do you think the wider world is now waking up, and we've called it the forgotten war? Do you think the wider world is now waking up to exactly just how bad things are in Yemen?
Well, I hope so, but we're still waiting, really. Yemen has fallen a bit in the shadow of the cataclysmic wars in Syria and in Iraq. I mean, the Aleppo and Mosul has gotten attention. The battle scene in Yemen hasn't really. Yemen is, to start with, much poorer than Syria and Iraq. The people there were on rock bottom when the conflict started. Then there has been boycotts and sanctions against the whole society. The public sector is not running at all anymore. And there is a shortage of food, so that millions of people are threatened with famine, and then they get cholera on top of that. It's an exponential increase in the number of cholera victims. When I was there a couple of months ago, I could see the first cholera victims coming into some hospitals. Today, there are tens of thousands all over the scene. It has to stop. There has to be more attention, and there has to be more resources coming into Yemen. And there has to be an end to this senseless conflict, and also to the sanctions against Yemen as a society.
Can I ask you a personal question? Because there aren't many people who would have your job, UN Special Advisor, head of the Norwegian Refugee Council. You know, you see some of the very worst of humanity and some of the very worst suffering in this world. Do you ever wake up in the morning and just despair?
Well, of course I do, because this is a unique period. I mean, Syria and Yemen are two cases to be mentioned. There are famines also threatening in three other countries, Somalia, South Sudan, and Nigeria. But at the same time, as I've seen humanity at our worst, with all of these warlords and dictators and terrorists and others going after the most vulnerable, including women and children, I've also seen humanity at our best. My organization, Norwegian Refugee Council, now has 12,000 people working in the field for us, on the front lines of humanity and for the displaced. And that gives me great hope, really. We can do more good than ever before, but we need to invest more in reaching all, and that is our quest.
Jan, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you. Thank you very much indeed for that, Jan Egeland.
Thank you. Bye.